Welcome to the 2023 NNLM Virtual Symposium on Health Misinformation. We're glad you're able to join us today. I'm Tiffany Chavis, the Health Literacy Librarian for Region 1 of the NNLM out of University of Maryland, Baltimore. We have just a few technical items to cover. All attendees have been muted, but we do welcome your questions and comments in the Zoom chat at any time. VFairs is providing technical assistance for us during today's session. NNLM staff will also be keeping an eye on the chat with me. Please be sure to select everyone from the drop-down menu when posting your comments in the chat to ensure everyone sees them. Submit any questions for the speaker using your Q&A function to ensure they don't get lost in the chat. We have live closed captioners for this event. You can access the closed captions by clicking on the icon with the 3 dots and then selecting closed caption. If you would like to share on social media, we do encourage you to do so using the hashtag for the event, which is Health Misinfo NNLM. Before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit more about who we are. The National Institutes of Health is the nation's leading medical research agency. Many of you might be more familiar with the National Center for Allergies and Infectious Diseases, which is one of the many institutes and centers at NIH. NLM, or the National Library of Medicine, is one of 27 institutes and offices of the National Institutes of Health. It is the world's largest biomedical library and produces online resources such as PubMed and Medline Plus. NNLM, or the Network of the National Library of Medicine, is an outreach program of NLM. And we work to ensure health professionals and the public have equal access to health information. The NNLM is made up of 7 regional medical libraries, 3 national offices, and 4 national centers, all providing training, funding, and engagement opportunities to over 9,000 NNLM member organizations. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, John Rzembek, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge. Welcome, John, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. Am I audible this way? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen for you to take over now.
Thank you very much. All right. I have a presentation prepared for today. Just sort of before I begin, I suppose, I really don't mind being interrupted. So if anyone has a question sort of in the meantime that sort of feels or sounds urgent, or if I say something that requires significant explanation, then I'm very happy to sort of just drop the presentation a bit and explain. I will have some time for questions afterwards as well, because I wouldn't want to bore anyone too much, at least for the evening. Can everyone see this presentation?
Yes, we can see it.
Great, good. It's always a bit of a, well, it's a bit tricky to figure this out from time to time. Right, so Prebunking misinformation on social media is the title of my talk today. And I think that the talk that I'm giving will be more or less sort of solution oriented, but meaning discussing the extent to which solutions that we have designed as researchers to counter misinformation online, discussing how well they've worked. But in order to do that, I think it's also useful to first at least talk a little bit about the problem definition and deciding what we might actually want to tackle. So uh, this research on pre-bunking, and I will explain what that is in a second, sits in a broader program of research that I've been working on, which I broadly sort of divide up into two different strands. Conveniently, I call these the supply side of online content production and misinformation, and the demand side. So on the supply side, I look a lot at like how propaganda is produced and disinformation, and how information warfare works, particularly in the context of Russia and Ukraine. My PhD was about media in Eastern Ukraine, media and identity there. I also work a lot on polarization, intergroup conflicts, and echo chambers on social networks, which of course ties into the question of misinformation quite a bit. And then I also do some research on how the consumption of misinformation relates to real world behaviors, for instance, vaccine uptake. And then on the demand side of misinformation, so how people receive and process information that is not true or is misleading and so on. I work on the psychological underpinnings of vulnerability to manipulation, misinformation, media effects. So for instance, can misinformation influence how people vote? And also finally, interventions to counter misinformation. And that's what I want to talk about today. But first, we do need to discuss definitions. And to start us off, talk about definitions. I've found this article online, which some of you may remember from about 10 years ago or 11 years ago by this point. Kim Jong-un named The Onion Sexiest Man Alive for 2012. Now, of course, this is not a true story, right? Well, at least Kim Jong-un was not named Sexiest Man Alive, maybe The Onion Sexiest Man Alive, but that is not the same as World Sexiest Man Alive, I suppose. Either way, the beautiful part of this story, at least for me, is that one website, the People's Daily, which is a Chinese news website, government run, fell for this. And so they actually thought this really happened. And so they reposted this article on their website with a slideshow of Kim Jong-un sitting on his horse and all these kinds of things, which for me is wonderful, because what this shows is that sometimes false information, fake news can spread, and some people can believe it and act upon that belief. And no harm is done whatsoever, right? Because in democratic countries, the ability to make fun of powerful people is held in high esteem. Satire is very important to the functioning of democratic societies. And so we don't tend to consider humor and satire to be harmful, even if you have to lie or you tell a lie, in service of that, right? So my point here is, just because something is false doesn't mean it causes any problems. It doesn't mean it's harmful in any way, right? Further to that, I think it's important to emphasize that misinformation for me doesn't mean fake news. Why do I say that? This is a study by Jennifer Allen and colleagues from 2020 in the journal Science Advances, where what they did was they looked at the consumption of fake news in relation to all the media content that they consume on a daily basis. And so that includes any television, any mobile, news or whatever other consumption on your laptop and all these kinds of things. Right? And so what you see here in this graph is the red lines or bars, if you will, are fake news. And as you can see, you can barely see it, right? It's not there, pretty much. It's way at the top, and it's like this tiny little slice almost, right? And basically, to summarize the findings of this paper, is Jennifer Allen and colleagues found that people barely, if ever, consume any fake news at all. And even if they do, this is mostly in very specific echo chambers where, it's just the consumption of all kinds of unreliable and trustworthy information is very common, including fake news, right? So relatively few people visit so-called fake news sources or see news articles that are rated as false by fact checkers. And what you might then say is, well, okay, well, I guess we don't have a problem then. That's good, right? Because if this specific problem of fake news, right, false headlines that fact checkers can rate as false is so small, then why are we so worried about this, right? Why are we spending all these resources and all this time and effort to combat a problem that is so tiny and small in scale? Well, for me, the answer to that question is the definition is off, right? So the definition of fake news being fact-checkably or verifiably false news headlines is, for me at least, far too narrow. And to accentuate that point, this is a headline from 2021, which was published in the Chicago Tribune and also the South Florida Sun Sentinel. I think that was the original publication. And the headline reads, "A healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting the COVID-19 vaccine, and the CDC is investigating why." And here, of course, the problem is every single word in the headline is true. All of this happened, right? Completely true information. However, the implication that is there, right, in this headline, namely the doctor died from the COVID vaccine, that's not true. So if you look up this article, you will see that it isn't, there's no evidence that the doctor died because he was vaccinated against COVID-19 or because he received the vaccine. So this was shared millions and millions and millions of times on all sorts of social media platforms, especially Facebook. So this went massively viral, right? And here we have a bit of an issue because surely a substantial number of people shared this because they made a wrong inference, meaning they assumed that there was a link or that there was some evidence to suggest a link between getting the COVID vaccine and this man dying, this doctor. And that can spread really far, but this isn't a fake news website. This isn't fakenewsonline.com, right? That published this. This is a perfectly good news website, or the Chicago Tribune newspaper, as far as I can tell, is a perfectly good outlet. So the point here is, just because something is false doesn't mean it's harmful, and just because something is true doesn't mean that there's no problem with it. And I would argue, in fact, that the seriously problematic content that we find online, the really harmful misinformation, often comes from more legitimate sources, right? For example, Andrew Wakefield published a paper in the early 90s, where he argued that there was a link between vaccines and autism. And this was published in The Lancet, which is a really well-respected medical journal, right? Obviously, it was later retracted. It was proven to be a fraud and all these kinds of things. But vaccination rates did dip in the countries where many people believed these rumors or were exposed to these rumors. It's reasonable to say that the publication of this paper played a role in the production of vaccine uptake. Right? So here we have a really, really, really pernicious issue, meaning the problem that we have is much broader than just fake news, and therefore also much more difficult to tackle. Okay. To accentuate this point even further, we need to look at, I believe, what we call disinformation. And so let's talk about tobacco first and the climate second. And with respect to tobacco, in 1994, there was this whistleblower. His name was Mr. Butts. He sent about 4,000 internal tobacco industry documents for a company called Brown and Williamson to Stanton Glantz, who was a professor at the University of California. I forget which one, it doesn't matter. And in these documents, you could read about basically a disinformation playbook used by tobacco companies to delay and soften legislation. It was a massive persuasion campaign or influence campaign, aimed not only at lawmakers, which they also targeted, but also the broader public. The point of which was, we don't necessarily care if people believe that cigarettes are completely harmless. The only thing we really want them to believe is that there's reasonable doubt that cigarettes cause cancer. So this is that tobacco disinformation playbook, and it consists of 3 components. And these are quotes that I took from the book that Stanton Glantz and his colleagues published called The Cigarette Papers. Very interesting read, by the way. It's fascinating. And so there's basically three components to this playbook. Number one is sow doubt. And so it says in the book that this is one of those internal communications by the Brown and Williamson employees. Doubt is our product since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. Right? It's also the best means, it's also the means of establishing controversy. And if we are successful in establishing a controversy at the public level, then there is an opportunity to put across the real facts about smoking and health. In their view, of course, the real facts are it's perfectly harmless, go right ahead. Right? The second tenet of this playbook is to counterattack. And the way that these PR people who worked for Brown and Williamson described this was their goal was to expose the incredible, unprecedented, and nefarious attack against the cigarette, constituting the greatest libel and slander ever perpetrated against any product in the history of free enterprise. Now, you might call this a slight exaggeration, hyperbole, if you will, but that was the goal behind it, right? It's not to be on the defensive, but to attack, to say we are the ones who are being targeted. These attacks against the cigarette are unfair, etc., etc., etc. And then the third component, the third tenet, I think is very, very, very important to bear in mind, which is do not lie, or at least not too much. Because if you lie, people don't like you so much anymore, right? Like you don't tend to have that many friends who lie to you all the time, right? It's bad for your reputation overall. And so another quote that I took from this book, truth is our message because of its power to withstand a conflict and sustain a controversy. If in our pro-cigarette efforts we stick to well-documented fact, we can dominate the controversy and operate with the confidence of justifiable self-interest. And so what they mean by that is there were several articles published in scientific journals, I wouldn't call them scientific articles necessarily, where it was said that there's no strong link between cigarettes and cancer and all these kinds of things, right? And things we now know to be false. Of course, the authors of these scientific articles were often, sponsored by the tobacco industry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that is what you refer to, right? You'd say like, well, look, this paper that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine or whatever says blah, 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 blah. The more prestigious the journal, the stronger your point is, right? But it has nothing to do with the underlying truth value, which is, does smoking cause cancer? The answer is yes, right? Okay. Let's talk about the climate and how climate disinformation works. And here you find strikingly, and perhaps not exactly shockingly, similar patterns. So this is an article by Jeffrey Sopran and Naomi Oreskes from Harvard, where they conducted this huge framing analysis of ExxonMobil's climate change communications over the period of many years. Right? And what they looked for were the rhetorical strategies that were used in these advertorials published by ExxonMobil, as well as internal communications and peer-reviewed publications that they sponsored somehow. And here, again, exactly the same pattern. These advertorials were aimed at delaying and softening climate action. That's it. Because climate action costs money, at least for ExxonMobil it does, right? At least in the short term, it costs money. Okay. And what does this playbook look like? Well, it so happens that it consists of the same three components. One might say that the reason that it exists of the exact same three components is that these are the same people who are writing these playbooks. So there's a great book by Naomi Oreskes, actually, the same woman as who's on this paper, from 2010 called Merchants of Doubt, where she describes how people move from the tobacco industry to the climate industry or anti-climate industry, to mount influence campaigns and so on. And so here again, the strategy is to, number one, sow doubt. There does not appear to be a consensus among scientists about the effect of fossil fuel use on the climate. It's one of the communications by ExxonMobil that was put out there publicly. Number two, counterattack, right? It is consumer demand for energy rather than a corporate supply of oil, coal, and gas that is the cause of fossil fuel production, right? It's the fact that we all want to heat our homes and, plug in our PlayStations and so on, right? That is simply a demand that fossil fuel companies are filling, right? Providing a supply for. And so it's our fault, in a sense, that the climate is as bad as it is, and the fossil fuel companies are mere sort of, receptacles of this demand, and they just provide the supply when they can. And then thirdly, the Sopran and Rescue's note in their article, there's not that much lying going on, right? And so they say, beyond outright disinformation, ExxonMobil may have employed rhetoric and framing to construct misleading public narratives about anthropogenic global warming, hoping that people would infer the wrong conclusions without explicitly lying to them. An interesting example of how that works, and that's when I will stop talking about how complicated I think this problem actually is, and so much more complicated than fake news, because we're still in that part of the talk, is this fascinating article, which I read a while ago and got, I felt a lot of indignation over it because it's a fascinating read. It's worth looking up. The Carbon Footprint Sham by Mark Kaufman. And this article explains in detail how in 2000, British Petroleum BP and hired a PR agency called Ogilvy and Mather to design for them a future-proof communications campaign with respect to what the activities of British Petroleum and so on with respect to climate change. And they launched this campaign called Beyond Petroleum. And as part of that campaign, which was very greenwashy, if you will, they launched a carbon footprint calculator. And that was a smashing hit. This is 2004, if I'm not wrong. And the carbon footprint calculator was basically a way for people to calculate their own individual impact on the environment and how they might reduce that impact, which in principle is a great thing. Because, of course, there are things that we as people can do to, especially in rich Western countries, right, to reduce our individual impact on the climate. But what's very much worth noting here, I believe, is that in 2020, when the whole world stopped traveling because of COVID-19, CO2 emissions, global CO2 emissions, dropped by about 8% compared to 2019. Now, that's a substantial drop, to be sure, right? But it's nowhere near enough to stave off more than 1.5 degrees Celsius in global heating. Okay? And so what drives global CO2 emissions to a very large extent is energy, to a certain extent also agriculture. But it doesn't necessarily seem to be fundamentally driven by individual humans' behavior, for example, flying and recycling and all these things, right? Now, again, that isn't to say that you should, therefore fly as much as you want. No, not, of course not. And that doesn't mean that recycling is therefore useless. Also, of course not. But that's where the insidiousness of this kind of rhetoric comes into play, which is to say, if we manage to shift the responsibility or the onus of the discussion as with respect to how to reduce climate change towards individuals and not, in this case, British Petroleum, right, then that draws the attention away from much more substantial reforms, for instance, leaving all the oil in the ground from now on, like that kind of stuff. So the point that I'm trying to make here is individual arguments, such as about promoting pro-environmental behavior, can be very reasonable. They don't have to be unreasonable per se. It's just that the problem that we're dealing with respect to tackling sort of some of the fundamental challenges in our society, is that we're dealing with a really subtle set of argumentation strategies. And oftentimes the point is of these strategies not to have a genuine discussion, for example, about the best way to tackle climate change, but rather to ensure that the focus stays away from curbing fossil fuel extraction. That's really complicated, right? Because how do you even begin to tackle that kind of thing through any kind of intervention? Or I work as a psychologist and I work in the psych department, right? So my inclination is to find individual level solutions for what might be sort of systemic problems or system level problems. And so to sort of dig into that a little bit deeper, this is a paper that I wrote together with my colleagues, Eileen Culotti and Jane Souter from Dublin City University in Ireland, where we did a review basically of all of the interventions that have been designed so far to tackle misinformation, to counter misinformation. And we divide these interventions up into two different categories: individual level interventions and system level interventions. And so system level interventions are things like changing recommender algorithms on social media websites, challenging or suggesting changes to business models, right, if they overlap with the spread of sort of unwanted content, passing legislation, right, for example, combating online harms or regulating tech platforms, as the UK is now doing and the EU is now doing. And then also geopolitical questions such as, you know, if there were to be a change of power somehow in Russia, that would presumably reduce the supply of disinformation in, let's say, Eastern Europe by quite a bit. But of course, that is not really the kind of thing that anyone can really have a meaningful say about, especially me being a psychologist who tends to focus on individual level solutions. So complicated stuff. The takeaway of that is basically system level interventions can have massive impact on the supply of misinformation on social platforms, let's say, or anywhere. But they also have tremendous downsides, potentially do, in the sense that you might accidentally crack down way too much on freedom of expression and all these kinds of things. Whereas individual level interventions tend to work okay at best, but you calculate their effectiveness in terms of statistical effect size, and those effect sizes are modest at best. But they work. And also they have very few downsides, meaning if I debunk a piece of misinformation, nobody's rights are going to be violated. It really doesn't really work like that, right? It's fine. And so individual level interventions can be divided up into four broad categories: debunking or fact checking, right? Literacy, which involves the health literacy, media literacy, digital literacy, all these kinds of things. Prebunking, which is what I will talk about in a second, and then nudging, which is basically hoping to affect a change in behavior by making changes to the choice environment. Now, I won't go into this in detail because it's a bit too much and a little bit too boring, but I do want to talk a little bit more about prebunking because this approach is something that I've been working on for a long time. And it is one that has also been informed a lot by what I've just explained about why misinformation, disinformation, et cetera, is such a pernicious and difficult to tackle problem. So prebunking is basically preemptive debunking, meaning you try to stay ahead of the curve by preemptively tackling misinformation. And the way that we've sought to do that is through this framework from social psychology called inoculation theory. And the inoculation theory is basically well, you might call it a metaphor, I suppose, the idea of a psychological vaccine against unwanted persuasion. And that psychological vaccine is basically a weakened dose of the actual misinformation, which then sort of preemptively, just like a real vaccine, sort of builds resistance against future, in this case, unwanted persuasion. And the way that you weaken this misinformation is by first providing an effective component, meaning warning people that they might be manipulated, and then secondly, refuting the misinformation preemptively. And so this has been around since the 1960s, but it's quite robust as far as psychological theories go, especially for a theory that was invented in the 1960s. There's not that many left today. Not that many things that psychologists came up with in the 1960s still hold up to scrutiny now that we are in the 2020s. But with respect to inoculation interventions, there's basically various types. And so traditionally what people would do is they would preemptively inoculate people against individual examples of misinformation, right? Individual facts or false facts or alternative facts, perhaps. And that's called issue-based inoculation. But more recently, people have moved on to trying to scale up this approach. And the way you scale it up is not necessarily by focusing on individual examples, but rather on the underlying strategies that are often used in the production of misinformation. And that sounds familiar. That's what I've been trying to explain just now with respect to the climate, anti-climate industry, the tobacco industry, and so on. Idea being, a lot of the manipulation that occurs, a lot of the misinformation that we see online tends to make use of similar tropes. And I'll explain what those are in a second. Also, it's not an exhaustive list, but there's quite a few that you can quite easily identify. where the idea is if you build psychological resistance against this underlying strategy, then people should be able to detect those kinds of strategies in all sorts of content, not just sort of specific content that they might have been inoculated against if you had used an issue-based inoculation. Focusing on that a little bit more, how do you go about doing that? Well, the first thing we did was we made some games, inoculation games, you might call them, or fake news games, if you will. And in these games, the idea is basically that you take on the role of a fake news producer. So there's 4 games that are out right now, with a few more coming, hopefully fairly soon. Bad News, Harmony Square, Cat Park, and Go Viral. And they all have sort of fairly similar scopes, I guess. Bad News is about just generally misinformation, very broadly, I suppose. Harmony Square is about political, electoral disinformation. Cat Park is similar to Harmony Square, just a lot more advanced graphically and looks really nice and really cool. And then Go Viral is about COVID-19 misinformation. And to kind of explain how that works, I've got a GIF of the Harmony Square game where you're hired to become a chief disinformation officer. You see that? Here you can click on the button and then you see it's your first day as our new chief disinformation officer. And then the first thing you need to do is pick a character, right? So you can pick a character, Evil Genius, or Carmen San Francisco, or Baking Soda. And let's go with Evil Genius. And then your role as Evil Genius is to sow discord and chaos on Harmony Square. And Harmony Square is a beautiful little community that has everything going for it, and your goal is to get everyone on the square to hate each other. So it's sort of lighthearted in that sense, where you try to approach this issue from a slightly different angle, right? You use humor, I guess, and a slightly different sort of perspective-taking exercise than a lot of other media literacy interventions to make the idea of learning about how misinformation and disinformation works sort of slightly more interesting, much like in some other video games you might play as the bad guy, I don't know, Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption and so on and so on. And that works quite well in the sense that you do find that people who play these games sort of rate misinformation as significantly less reliable after they're playing, so that's good news. And we've also done some longitudinal studies and all these things. So overall, the results are pretty good, which is nice, right? It basically goes to show that it is possible for an intervention like this to attract sort of a player base that goes to the website voluntarily and plays it, who also actually sort of learn something relatively meaningful from the intervention. So that's good news. But there's also a substantial problem with this, namely the scalability. So the vast majority of people will not play a game, right? That's just how it works. You have to get someone, convince someone to buy in, to sit down and play a game for 10 minutes, let's say, on their own, right? And even if it's the most entertaining game in the world, which this isn't, still a large number of people are never going to do that. So there's also the problem that the more scalable the intervention is, the smaller the effect size, which problematically tends to mean if you start out with a really small effect size, there will be very little left by the time you actually roll out your interventions in the real world. What do I mean by that? The numbers are not exactly clear, but we know from the best available evidence that if you do a study in the lab and you find a particular, statistical effect size and all that kind of stuff, if you then roll out this same intervention under non-ideal conditions, meaning outside of lab studies, outside of MTurk and all these kinds of places, you can expect a huge attenuation of the effect. The effect size just shrinks by a factor of about 6. So interventions become more or less 6 times less effective. I'm basing this off of a single paper by Stefano Della Vigna and Elizabeth Linos, from 2022, which is a great paper where they compare nudging interventions, which I've mentioned before, in the lab and in the field, and they find that massive attenuation. So for me, what that means is you need to start out with a really robust effect size. So you can't expect your small effects to remain detectable if you roll them out in the real world, in the field. And also, it's just really expensive and difficult to run these kinds of stuff. So to address these questions, we published this article recently in the journal Science Advances. This was in August of last year. And what we did for that study is, instead of games, we created little short videos about misinformation, each of which tackles a particular manipulation technique. So emotional language, emotional manipulation, false dilemmas or false dichotomies. If you're not with me, you're against me, right? Incoherence, making mutually exclusive arguments, scapegoating, and ad hominem attacks, attacking the person, not the other. And so each of these videos is about a minute and a half long, approximately. And I've actually got one here, which I can show to you, which will explain sort of how we, or like it will show you how we created the video and what you're supposed to learn if you watch this.
Stop watching the lamestream media.
Is this audible, by the way?
Oh, puppies to die. Makes sense, right?
Yes, I could hear it.
Because it shouldn't.
Sorry? It's not clear?
Yeah, we can hear it.
Okay, good. Sorry.
It's a common manipulation technique called a false dichotomy or a false dilemma. It's designed to make you think you only got two choices to choose from, when in reality, there are more. As with our little dilemma at the beginning, there's no reason why you can't watch mainstream media and want all puppies to live. The two don't rule each other out. And by presenting you with an option that is clearly undesirable and the option the manipulator wants you to pick, your choices are narrowed down for you. A famous example of a false dilemma is this one from Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith.
My allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. If you're not with me, then you're my enemy.
Anakin's claim that Obi-Wan is either with him or is his enemy is a clear case of false dichotomy. Obi-Wan is trying to prevent Anakin from joining the dark side, which naturally involves being critical of Anakin's choices. But just because Obi-Wan disagrees with Anakin doesn't automatically make them enemies. Obi-Wan's reply is actually perfect.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Good old Obi. Be on the lookout for instances of false dichotomies in real life. They're more common than you think. True laughs. When things are too black and white, dare to be gray.
Right. So that's one of the 5 videos that we made. And then, of course, you need to test these. And so we did that by testing the videos first in the lab with about 6,000 participants, 1,000 per study, give or take. And what we were looking for was whether watching this video makes you meaningfully better at discerning sort of manipulative from neutral content, right? And so that's what you see here, these red dots on the x-axis have plotted the effect size in Cohen's d, which is the higher the better. Basically, what you see here is that for each of these videos, these red dots are really far away from 0. And that's really good. 3 stars means tiny, tiny p-values, meaning we're highly certain that these effects are real. And so that's good news in the sense that watching this video meaningfully improves your ability to recognize these manipulation techniques in social media content that you've never seen before, which is great, right? Good news, everybody's happy. But the problem is that doesn't prove anything as far as like the real world effects of your intervention go. So what we did after we ran these lab studies, we ran an ad campaign on YouTube where we showed 2 of the videos that we made, one of which you just saw, and the other was the emotional language or emotional manipulation video, to about 5 million YouTube users approximately, who were Americans over 18 who like to consume political news on YouTube. And we then used YouTube's brandlet feature to collect survey responses, right, within YouTube, which is really nice because they allow you basically to ask people a single survey question. And normally that is used to ask people about brand recognition. You know, are you familiar with, you know, Nike shoes, whatever it is, right? But we use that to actually to ask people the following. As you can see here, we gave people a sentence or a headline, right? People are either part of the solution or they're part of the problem. And then we gave them the option to respond. This sentence contains a command, fear mongering, false dichotomy, or none of these, right? And we also had a control group that did not see any of the videos, but did get one of these survey questions. And in total, we had about 6 of these sentences, 3 per video. And then what we hoped to see was that, of course, that the treatment group is significantly better at this than the control group. And that is indeed what we found. And you can see here on the x-axis, the percentage increase of technique recognition by the treatment group compared to the control group. And you want that to be higher than 0. And so here you can see item number 1, airline, called it airline, that's the name of the summary of the sentence. Overlaps to 0 completely, no effect there, nothing meaningful to write home about, right? But for all the others, you can see that all these headlines, all these items are, you know, shifted to the right, and they don't overlap with 0, aside from this one, which barely overlaps. And overall, you find this about 5% increase in technique recognition, correct identification of what manipulation technique, if any, is used in a particular sentence. And so that's really wonderful, in the sense that what we find is that even in an environment like YouTube, where you don't pay people, they have every incentive to turn off the ad, or, you know, click it away, or turn off the sound, or whatever it might be. Right? You can still find that there's apparently enough people who retain this information that there is a meaningful and measurable improvement in people's ability to recognize this kind of misinformation, which is great as far as the scalability goes. Of course, we can argue over whether this 5% increase is meaningful, but that's a different question, I suppose. At least the effect is there, right? So that's good news. I'll skip this because we're running out of time a little bit, but we have several of these ongoing projects now in different countries, because a lot of this work, embarrassingly, in the misinformation research space, but also in general across all of psychology, so much of our work is focused on the United States, which is not good. So we've been running not similar exactly projects in India, Iraq, Brazil, and Tunisia, where we want to see if we can, you know, produce susceptibility to misinformation through prebunking there. The last thing I want to note is this really problematic issue, if you ask me, with respect to the state of the research. And we pointed this out, I did at least together with my colleague Fabiana Zollo from the University of Venice. This YouTube study that I just presented, which we published in this journal, Science Advances, which we're very happy about, was $40,000. And that means that there isn't really anyone who can replicate it. It's literally like the only reason people believe this is because I'm telling them that, and people trust me that I've done my data analysis correctly and that I'm not cheating and something like that. Now I'm not, obviously, but, you know, just trust me isn't exactly scientific, nor is it, systemically speaking, a great way to go about designing and testing our interventions. And so what this leads to is the kind of privilege that leads to diminished scrutiny and also unwanted interdependence, because the reason we were able to pay for this study was because it was sponsored by Google, right? And tying this back to the individual level versus system level debate, if we talk about prebunking as the solution to misinformation, implicitly what we're saying is we're focusing on the individual to solve these problems, even though the problem might actually be systemic. Meaning it might be the algorithm that's luring people into nonsensical content. Maybe we should do something about that rather than sort of implementing silly little videos everywhere. All of which is to say, it's really worth thinking about democratizing this kind of research, making it more accessible to people with less money and people with less privilege than I have. So thank you very much for listening. The only thing that I wanted to do was give you a little bit of a sneak peek, because we have a few new videos that we made, partially in response to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which is something I care very deeply about on account of my research. And these are new videos that are a bit different from the ones that we made before. We're about to test them, so they're, you know, not exactly public knowledge quite yet, but, you know, we just wanted to give people a sneak peek, unverified information, this whole thing, but just so in case anyone is interested, here we go.
Trust me, is your real name. You stand accused of medical malpractice. It is claimed that you tried to market breadfruit juice as a cure for the broken arm. How do you plead? Innocent, Your Honor. What about Dr. Scammy, who peddled apple juice to cure a broken leg? He's not in jail, is he? I rest my case. Pointing a finger at another is no legal defense. Guilty as charged. Trustee used a fallacy known as whataboutism. In an attempt to save his own skin and distract the jury from his crime, he tried to point at someone else doing the same thing. Whataboutism works like this. Something can be wrong just because something else is also wrong. You'll notice it everywhere. World leaders deflecting blame for human rights violations by pointing at another country's behavior. Lying politicians deflecting attention to their rivals' lies, so on. It's a disturbing tactic where nothing can possibly be wrong. As long as the manipulator can think of other examples that are just as bad or worse. Be on the lookout for whataboutism when you go online. Someone can be pulling your strings.
All right, that's it from me. Thank you very much. I just wanted to thank my collaborators on this particular work and from my lab and from Cambridge and elsewhere who have been really helpful in sort of designing and forming all of this work. So thank you very much. And just for those who are interested, if you have any questions that I can't address right now, this is my email address, so you'll have to receive emails, jzr51@can.ac.uk. And these are the references that I have cited in this talk, in case anyone is interested. Okay, thank you very much. Can I stop sharing or shall I keep sharing for now, the screen?
You can stop sharing and then I'll put up our closing slides. But first, I want to see if anyone has any questions. I don't see any in the Q&A currently, but there was a comment that I wanted to read from Wen to see if maybe you wanted to speak on it. It says, I had a student who wanted to know how the carbon footprint calculator from the UN worked. We couldn't find a data source listed, and when we emailed the UN about it, they will not identify any specific data sources. I was wondering if they had drew on what you said about the oil companies and what they put out.
I must admit that I have no idea. I don't know. I haven't made any of these carbon footprint calculators myself. It should be in principle based on a set of assumptions, right? Like you know, this behavior emits this much CO2, and then you sort of do the math, I guess. Just adding it all up to come up with a certain sum. I assume that's how it works, but I have no idea what assumptions they make and how good those are.
Yeah, who knows?
Oh, cool.
And Wim was saying it wasn't a question, just a thought. Understood. I just figured I put it out there since we didn't have any questions. Someone did ask how you access the videos. We
right.
did find some links and put them in the chat, but how would you?
Yes, we have a website for this, www.inoculation.science. That should help. I can also wait. Hold on.
All right. Well, at this point, we still don't have any questions, so I am going to go ahead and start sharing my screen again. I guess I gotta go in here first. Oh, wait a sec. Oh, we do have a question now. How did Google react to your results?
Oh,
They gave you
so this is a unit within Google called Jigsaw that sponsored the research project, the creation of the videos, as well as the randomized control trials and so on. So they were interested in exploring this, and they contacted us as well as our collaborator at the University of Bristol, Stefan Lewandowski, to help work on this project with them. So yeah, I assume they were quite happy. Yeah. I don't know how Google broadly has reacted. That's more difficult for me to know. But the Jigsaw people were quite excited, which I guess is nice. But again, sort of, I think it's useful to point out here that there's a risk of sort of being too happy about these results and then sort of losing sight of potential sort of systemic problems, as opposed to you know, individual level problems. Did they say how they would use your data? No, so we collected the data, and all the data that we collected for this is public. Yeah, so it's all on the articles. There's an Open Science Framework webpage that we created where everyone can download all the data that we collected, basically. Or is that not what you meant? Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's what it
Yeah,
is.
yeah. So it's open data. The whole thing is sort of public for anyone to check. Yeah. We also have like the surveys and stuff uploaded. So if anyone wants to like replicate what we did, it should be pretty easy. I hope, at least. But it's also, I mean, it's a fairly straightforward finding in a sense that, like, do people learn information from videos? Answer is yes. So not necessarily controversial, I guess.
Yeah, they would be great to like put on, as advertisements, like on
Yeah.
TV and, on YouTube and, so forth.
Sorry?
On YouTube and, other things that have commercials on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a possibility for sure. Yeah. Theoretical. I mean, it's also like the videos. I mean, I wrote the scripts for these things, and I'm like a white guy in my early 30s, right, from Holland, and so I have certain sort of tastes and preferences and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I like might not be useful for everyone at all. So there's also certainly like adaptations that need to be made to make these things sort of perhaps sort of that more palatable or more entertaining for different audiences. About the sincerity of Jigsaw, so they're part of Google, and so they can only be like I think I've talked to them quite a bit. Like their intentions are definitely like at least sincere as far as I can tell, that they are good sponsors of research in the sense that they're not like, they accept sort of critical comments from me and other researchers and all these kinds of things. So that's nice to see. But it is certainly true that like they're not doing this out of the goodness of their heart. I think they have sort of interest in sort of tackling misinformation in a certain way and all these types of things. So you need to be careful about that. And so that's why I think it's good to keep sort of pointing that out and sort of reassessing critically sort of your own affiliations and your own work and all these kinds of things. That isn't necessarily to say anything bad about them. It's just, as a university researcher, you have to be careful that you're not accidentally usurped, I suppose, by or sort of being put out front to defend a particular company's, whatever it is, policies and so on. That's not my job at all. So, yeah.
All right. I didn't see any other new questions or comments. So I guess I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this up.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for the questions also.
All right. Got a thanks, John, and great presentation from Miles, my colleague. And the thank yous are rolling in from the rest of the crowd. I'm sure you see them. I also want to say thank you again, John, and to all of you for joining us here for day 2 of the Health Misinformation Symposium. This is the last session of the day. So we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow for the final keynote speakers. And that will be Amanda Wilson, Ella Kesselman, and Catherine Arnott-Smith. And they are the editors of Combating Online Health Misinformation, a professional's guide to helping the public. Lastly, before we wrap up, I want to encourage you to join the network. Membership is organizational, not individual, and offers benefits such as funding opportunities and print resources. And then for our last slide, we wanted to tell you a little bit about some upcoming programming we have. These sessions are for our Health Misinformation webinar series. The series features presentations from expert guest speakers and will enable librarians, public health professionals, health educators, and healthcare providers to explore various aspects of health misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, and to learn practical and evidence-based ways or evidence-based solutions. And help identify it and help curb its spread. So these presentations will be scheduled intermittently throughout the year, and you can learn about upcoming sessions by checking out our NNLM training calendar on our website. So again, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow.